Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to today's session. This is part of the training series that we started on Tuesday and which we are ending today. Today's topic is entitled Compliance and Implementing HR Audit Outcomes. Welcome and feel at home. And if there are any questions that you want to ask, please do so. You are also free to interrupt where you are not aligned to what I've said, and also to make comments as we proceed. I want us to go through the content of our topic today. There are quite a number of issues that we are going to address, starting with an overview of the various labor laws and regulations. I believe that at this point, we are all familiar with the major labor laws that govern the employment relationship. We are going to mention a number of them, starting with the Employment Act 2007, the Labor Relations Act, NSSF Act, Work Injuries and Benefits Act, as well as Occupational Safety and Health Act. These are the laws that regulate our relationship as managers with our employees in our organizations. So we are going to look at the areas that are regulated with respect to the various functions of the HR department. And this is what we are going to audit when we set out to undertake this important exercise. Secondly, we are going to look at areas of compliance, and specifically we shall be looking at areas to do with the recruitment and selection, what in it is regulated. For example, the employment contract. It's a provision in the Employment Act that a person who has worked for more than 3 years should be given an employment contract. Among other things, we are going to look at compensation, we are going to look at health and safety, and specifically point out some of the aspects that are regulated and that require our compliance. Thirdly, we are going to look at the consequences of not complying with the labor laws. I have alluded to this before, and we are going to look at them today in detail, particularly those penalties and fines that may arise if we don't comply. And non-compliance here is at 2 levels. 1 at the individual level as a HR manager, and 2 at the organizational level. If we don't comply out of our own ignorance as HR managers, we may be personally liable. But if it's an organizational issue which the HR manager may have nothing to do with, then that becomes an organizational compliance. However, as a HR manager, you have a responsibility of advising your managers on the need for compliance with all the labor laws. And where you are not sure, you have a responsibility of consulting a legal expert, especially on matters to do with the labor laws, or your internal legal office. Number 4, we are going to look at gaps in terms of compliance. That how do we go about identifying areas that are not compliant with a view to taking corrective measures. There are quite a number of things that we are going to look at, one of which is establishment of a clear policy. if you don't have one in particular areas. So a policy will enable us to identify areas where we have deficits, and from then on, we can all recommend ways of improving the areas where we have difficulties. Next is communicating audit findings. We all know that communication is a very key component in the management of people in organizations. And this communication can be done in various ways, but we are not going to look at the methods of communication, but the key requirements of communicating these findings. For example, when you are communicating, it must be very clear communication. It must be timely. It must be relevant, and it must be targeted. So with this in mind, we are going to look at how HR managers doing the audits can communicate the findings. And in this regard, we are going to look at the importance of sharing these findings. Otherwise, it will be like the biblical saying that it's pointless for a man to light a lamp and put it under the bed. This HR audit is the lamp, and we don't want to put it under our drawers. We need to share the findings, which will be used for improving our systems. Remember yesterday, we talked about ways of improving, and we mentioned quite a number of them. So these improvements cannot be realized unless we communicate. And then we are going to look at how we can gain the support of all the stakeholders. Who are these stakeholders? On Tuesday, we mentioned this. The other departments within the organization, the leaders of the organization, the internal customers, the government, among others. So buy-in has to do with the support. So we are going to look at ways in which we can enhance the support of the various stakeholders. If we don't, several things are likely to happen. One, there will be resistance. And two, there might be no support. So to ensure that this transition after the HR audit is smooth and seamless, we are going to ensure that everybody is in the loop and that they are contributing as required. And then lastly, we'll be looking at how we can develop sustainable plans to ensure that there is continual improvement. And I'm using the word continual deliberately. That is not something that we are going to do year in, year out without improvement. So continual improvement means that there is sustainable value addition to what we have started doing, and that is conducting the human resource audit, which I believe once this course is complete, will be transferred to organizations for purposes of implementation or sharing. Having said that, I want us to go to the first subtopic or subheading, that is the overview of the labor laws and regulations. And we shall restrict ourselves to the Kenyan labor laws because these are the ones that are regulating us. Occasionally, I'll be talking about international institutions like ILO, from which most of our labor laws are derived. So our first topic there is an overview of the labor laws, and I will address myself to the areas highlighted in red, starting with what the labor laws are doing. The labor laws in Kenya are meant to regulate or govern the employment relationship. The employment relationship we are talking about here is two-way. One, between employees themselves, and 2, between employees and managers. What should be the nature of this relationship? It should be cordial. Cordial in the sense that there are no conflicts which may arise and thus disturb the relationship. So the labor laws that we are going to look at help to enhance this relationship. How? By providing the framework and the parameters within which the employers and the employees will be operating so that they do not conflict each other. So the employment relationship is key because once there is no good this relationship, then it means that there will be no work done. Or if there's no work done, there will be so many lawsuits or litigations, and it takes a lot of time and money to resolve some of these issues. So if the parties or the members of the organization work together in harmony, they are likely to promote a good relationship, free of conflict. And the labor laws, therefore, provide the groundwork and the framework within which all of us must operate. Number 2, the labor laws help to protect employees and employers in terms of their rights and their duties. Allow me to talk about the employee rights before I talk about employers' duties. You and I are employees of one organization or another. The labor laws, particularly the Employment Act, the Work Injuries and Benefits Act, NSSF Act, as well as the Occupational and Safety Act, provide certain rights, and these rights are entitlements that it is enshrined in our Constitution. And by the way, all the laws that we develop in the form of acts of parliament, which regulate the employment relationship, are derived from our Constitution. So in the Constitution, under the Bill of Rights, employees have the following rights. And I will mention maybe 4 before I move on. Number 1, the right to an employment contract. I will repeat, the right to an employment contract. Number 2, the right to fair compensation. Fair compensation. Number 3, the right to fair treatment. Fair treatment. And number 4, the right to be paid. There are many rights that I can mention, and the list is endless. So what I'm trying to say here is that the labor laws provide employees with certain rights which the employer must respect. However, these rights have limits, so we should not allow employees to have rights beyond what is provided for in law. For example, employees do not have a right to infringe on other people's rights. And that's a topic we can talk about another day. Going to the employer duties, these are the obligations of the employer. And the employer here is the organization for which we are working. And because the organization is an entity that can be sued and can sue, it is represented by its managers. So the managers are the employers, and we as managers are obligated to do certain things. I will mention 4. 1, provide a conducive environment. That's a duty of the employer, a conducive environment. Number 2, pay employees on time. So after employees have worked, they have a right to be paid. So the duty of the employer is to pay employees on time. A duty number 3 is to promote and practice fair treatment, fairness. So the employers must demonstrate fairness in all areas of activity, be it training, there should be fair treatment, be it recruitment, fair treatment, be it payment, fair treatment, be it promotion, fair treatment. I will be talking about some of the fair treatments under the various areas covered in law, and we shall look at what the duties of the employees, of the employers are with respect to fair treatment. Another aspect related to labor laws is the regulation of wages, working hours, and conditions. Talking of wages, the Employment Act, which is one of the labor laws, stipulates the minimum wages that employers can pay their employees, especially for those people who are at the lower cadres. The maximum wage is not provided, so it is up to the organization to decide how much they wish to pay their employees. But minimum wages are there to protect the employees from harsh economic conditions. On working hours, the labor provides that a working day is from 8 to 5. However, this can vary depending on the organizational policies and requirements, in the sense that these working hours can be extended or reduced depending on the conditions. When working hours are extended, it means that there is overtime. So the law regulates overtime, and I will talk about it a little while. And then the working conditions, this has to do with the health and safety of employees. Under WIBA and OSHA, these conditions are defined, and particularly the minimum working conditions like lighting, fresh air, and water, which we are all entitled to. So those working conditions must be conducive to support the performance of our employees. Another aspect of the labor laws is non-discrimination. That the law by its own nature promotes fairness and equity. If employers discriminate against the employees, then they are violating the law. What are the forms of discrimination that can occur in an organization? I will mention 4. 1, nepotism, where an employer is discriminating against an employee because of relationships, nepotism. Number two is tribalism. Particularly in Africa, the tribal element is very common, where people from one community are given jobs or promoted or paid well to the disadvantage of other communities. So the second aspect of discrimination is nepotism. The other one is gender discrimination. That people are not given equal opportunities because of their gender, particularly in organizations which are paternalistic in nature. What do I mean by paternalistic? They are dominated by male managers or employees. Given our cultural backgrounds, it has been the culture that women should not occupy managerial positions, that their place is in the kitchen and taking care of their children and husbands. This has changed. The law has provided equal opportunities for everyone, irrespective of their gender. So everybody, whether male or female or otherwise, have a right to employment, have a right to be paid, have a right to promotion. So I've mentioned 3 or 4 aspects of discrimination, starting with the nepotism, 2, tribalism, 3, gender. Another one could be skin color. This has to do with race. That for a long time, the people who are light-skinned, the so-called white people, are given priority, and those who are black are given the last options. This is another form of discrimination which is discouraged under the Employment Act 2007. The second last aspect related to labor laws as part of our overview is that they are enforced by the Ministry of Labor and the regulatory bodies. The Ministry of Labor provides guidelines on matters to do with employment relationships. For example, in cases of disputes, there are labor councils that are formed to guide the disputing parties in finding a solution to their problems. So the ministry has various units within it that deal with labor relations. And this ministry helps in ensuring that employees and employers work together harmoniously. So where there are disputes between the employer and the employees, either individually or through the trade union, the Ministry of Labor can intervene by way of conciliation. And that is provided for under the Labor Institutions Act. Going to regulatory bodies, these are institutions within government, probably outside the Ministry of Labor, that also provide guidelines on what is to be done in organizations. I will mention two main regulatory bodies which do not fall under the purview of the Ministry of Labor. One is NEMA, National Environment Management Authority. This body is concerned with the environmental matters and is mandated to ensure that the environment in which we operate is conducive, is healthy and safe. Speaking of NEMA, we are talking about waste management. Our organizations produce waste, either solid waste or fluid, liquid waste. So how we dispose this waste is regulated by NEMA. So as HR managers, and because we are in charge of the health and safety of our employees, we need to dispose our waste in the prescribed manner and in the prescribed places, meaning that there should be no dumping of waste anywhere in our organizations. Not only it is a health hazard, but it's also against the law. So that is one body that regulates our relationship in organizations. The second one is the Office of the ODPC. ODPC stands for Office of the Data Protection Commission. Data Protection Commission. This is a regulatory body that was formed in 2019 with a view to ensuring that people or organizations do not lose their data or have their data shared without their consent, because data can be used for many other purposes other than the employment purposes. So the Office of the OPDC regulates the way we process, store, share, and transmit data. So again, within this presentation, I will be sharing with us some of the data that is regulated so that we know that the labor laws are there to be complied with. And our topic is compliance and implementation of the HR audit. And lastly, as I finish on the overview, is that the labor laws vary across countries and industries. When you talk about countries, that the labor laws in Kenya may not be the same as those in Tanzania or anywhere in the world. Each country has developed its own laws, and therefore anybody going to those countries must comply with the laws of those foreign countries. That whatever may be legal in countries like Kenya may be illegal in other countries. So as we employ people from outside, we must be conversant with the labor laws that are in operation in those other countries, so that we do not bring conflict between countries. For example, there are countries that do not have diplomatic relations with others. Without permission of the government, HR managers cannot recruit employees from those other countries because there is no relationship. Otherwise, you might be accused of espionage, which means leaking country information to other countries where there are no relationships. And then industries, these are sectors within an economy which are regulated by the various laws. In Kenya, we have two main industries, and there are sectors and subsectors within them. For example, we have the industry of manufacturing. These are organizations that produce goods, and most of them are in industrial area. And then secondly, there are service industries. These are organizations that provide services. And most government bodies are service organizations. These industries are regulated. For example, manufacturing industries have their own set of laws which regulate the way they conduct their businesses. So basically, that is an overview of the various labor laws which we are going to look at in detail. So I want to propose that we move to the next part, and that is the areas covered under the labor laws with respect to HR functions or areas of operation. Number one is the employment contracts. Employment contracts are provided for under the Employment Act. The Employment Act we are referring to is 2007. There are various types of contracts that are covered or provided for under the Employment Act. Number one is permanent or long-term contracts. These are contracts that last the lifetime of an employee in the organization until they resign or their contracts are terminated, or God forbid, until they die. So the contract runs for a long time until the employee retires. So that's a long-term contract, which is permanent and pensionable. The second type of contract provided for in the law is the fixed-term contract, where employees are engaged for a period of time, from 6 months to 1 year to 3 years or 5 years. So as managers, as we give contracts to our employees, we also have in mind what I have called the fixed term. It is for a period of time. So the contract ends at the end of the time of the contract. So it automatically expires until the employee applies for a renewal, and it's not automatic that the employer can renew. It is not automatic. And perhaps we can ask questions around this as we move forward. The other type of contract is part-time contract, where people are engaged for a number of hours, either in a day or a week or a month. It is called part-time because they are not engaged the whole day. And this contract is defined under the Employment Act. The other type of contract is casual. These are contracts for people who work for a day or for a week, and the contract ends for as long as it does not exceed 1 month. So the law provides that casual contracts should not last for 1 month. Otherwise, if it lasts for 3 months, it automatically becomes a permanent contract. There are other contracts which are also defined in the Employment Act, and one of which is for a period of time, like doing a piece of work. This is job-based contract, that a person is engaged to work for a period of time on a particular project. The Employment Act says that these are basically contractors. They are engaged to do a job to completion and to the satisfaction of the employer. But one difference between this and the others is that the employer does not have control over the contractor. What the employer requires is completion of the task to satisfaction and meeting specifications. So those are the contracts that are defined in the Employment Act. So in this contract, there are rights and duties of the employers and employees. I've already mentioned the rights and duties. I now propose that we go to the second area covered in the law, and that is wages and benefits. Again, the Employment Act has a comprehensive coverage of what should be done when and how with regard to wages or salaries and benefits. I have highlighted several of them here. That is the minimum wage, which is regulated. And we all know that there are some companies that are on the radar of government for violating the minimum wages, especially the security and the supermarkets, which are paying below the minimum wage. It's against the law to pay anybody below the minimum wage. And perhaps I can ask a general question to all of us. What is the current minimum wage in Kenya? Current minimum wage in Kenya? Anybody who can answer that? Hannah, if you are there, you can answer that.
Is it 36,000?
Sorry?
I'm sure, but is it 36,000?
36 is on the higher side. Wairimu, if you are there, you can answer that question. Okay. Just a minute. The minimum wage is about 14,000, going by the requirements of the labor law, that is the Employment Act. So anybody paying below the 15,000 is guilty of an offense, which is punishable under the law. Second is overtime. I've mentioned that overtime is the extra time that employees work beyond the stipulated time of 8 hours, which can be extended. So when the 8 hours are extended, it becomes overtime. So what is the requirement here? The requirement is that the employers will pay double the normal rates double. And that means that any extra time an employee works, they should be paid extra money because that time could have been used doing other things. So you pay overtime. And for government, overtime can be done over the weekend or beyond 5. And then the other aspect is social security. This has to do with the protection of employees from mental and health issues, as well as financial. One of the provisions in the law is that employers who have more than 5 employees should register with NSSF, and that is a requirement. NSSF is a social security aspect which takes care of employees when they retire. We are also socially responsible organizations, which means that when we employ people, we should also consider their retirement. And this is also regulated by RBA. Number 3 is the health and safety aspects, which are covered in law. And this relates to workplace safety and health standards. I want to mention several standards for purposes of this presentation. Number 1 is protection from injury or harm of employees. Protection of employees. They should be protected from injury or harm. So how do we protect our employees? 1, we give them protective equipment, PPEs. Number 2, we ensure the workplace is clean and safe. Number 3, we ensure the workplace is well ventilated, that there should be enough air circulating in the workstations of employees. 4, that there is enough space for employees to operate. The minimum requirement under the Work Injuries and Benefits Act, as well as OSHA, is 3 meters square. That the distance between you to the next person should be at least 3 meters to ensure that there is ease of movement or even exit in case of an emergency. Number 4, there should be natural lighting, that we minimize the use of artificial lighting like electricity. So we should get natural light from the windows or from the roofs. And this is healthy for all employees because the sun provides us with vitamin D, especially in the morning. So we should have natural light. And then number 5, regular maintenance or servicing of office equipment, tools, and machines. Because without this regular service, the machines or tools can snap at any time, which can endanger the lives of people. And another standard is provision of health standards, that is clean, safe drinking water. That employees should be provided with clean and safe drinking water so that they are not harmed. It should be safe and it should be clean, that is free from any debris. There are also other provisions under the health and safety component that is compensation of employees when they are injured or they fall ill while they are working. So again, we shall look at some of the areas, the specific aspects that are covered under the various functions of HR. For employee welfare under health and safety, excuse me, that we should protect the well-being of the employees so that they operate and produce intended results. One of them is the aspect of stress, that when employees are stressed, the employer is duty-bound to provide counseling services so that the employees continue working. But again, preventive measures are very important, that if employees become stressed because of work-related issues like workload, then we should balance the workload. Or two, we give the employees time off to go and rest. Those periods of rest help to rejuvenate the mind and the health of employees. Unfortunately, for some organizations, employees are very happy to stay away from work because it is a way of detoxing. That means that the environment in which they work is very toxic. When such happens, where employees are detoxing away from the organization, then there is every reason to worry, because the welfare of the employees are not well taken care of, and two things are likely to happen. One, poor performance, and two, employee exit. Going to point number 4 is working hours and leave. I've talked about working hours which are provided. That is the normal working hours from 8 to 5. 8 working hours with breaks within between. But I want to talk about leave entitlements, which you were all familiar with. There are various types of leave that are covered under the Employment Act. One is the annual leave of 21 days within a year. Number 2 is sick leave, and this varies from organization to organization. It must be 7 days with pay, and another 7 days with half pay. And after that, the contract can be terminated on account of sickness. But again, there are provisions of terminating a contract on account of leave, on account of sickness. And again, this is a topic we can cover another day. Secondly, there is another type of leave, which is number 3, which is maternity leave. This is entitled to women for 90 days. The minimum provision under the Employment Act is 90 days. Anything less than 90 days is against the law. Some organizations have more than 90 days maternity leaves. The longest I've had is 1 year with full pay. This is one of the employers that many of us may want to work with. Number 4 is paternity leave. And this is leave given to male employees for a maximum period of 2 weeks. I am assuming that this leave is very important because the father will be with the mother and the new child for that period to demonstrate their responsibility of care. However, some of us don't really stay with our spouses when we have this leave. That's an opportunity for some of us to do other things. area number 5 is anti-discrimination and equal opportunity. I've alluded to this before, that there should be no discrimination. And I want to address myself to the Employment Act 2007 and what aspects of our labor practices are regulated so that we don't discriminate. Number one, under the recruitment and selection, is equal opportunity employment. That all of us have a right to be given equal chances to be employed. Whether we are physically challenged, whether we are male or female, whether we belong to one tribe or the other, we all have an equal chance of being recruited. So as we embark on the recruitment and selection exercise, we must keep this provision at the back of our mind, that everybody has an equal opportunity for employment. And this is without exception. If discrimination or inequality is perceived, an employee, or a potential employee might go to court to seek legal redress. The second aspect regulated under recruitment and selection is data protection. That we collect a lot of data about the prospective employee during this recruitment exercise. And this data must be protected at all times. I will talk about the data as I promised, such as family background, 2, education, 3, health records, and 4, payments. So this information should not be given to anybody during recruitment and selection. This is private and confidential and can only be accessed by authorized person or upon request by security agencies. And by security agencies, I mean the police. And this can only be provided for upon the clearance from a court of law that they should come and look for this confidential information. So that is an area that is regulated, and we are talking about discrimination. So people should not be discriminated against on account of their gender or their age or educational background. And these laws are there to prevent discrimination against people. The last area that is protected, and this is the data protection. This is captured under the Kenya Data Protection Act. As I said, it was created in 2019, and it relates to the record security and the confidentiality. The records that we give should be secure. Secure in the sense that they are protected from unauthorized access or from manipulation or from theft or from tampering. Because the moment a record is tampered with, then it becomes inaccurate, and that can lead to a legal process under the Data Protection Act. Recently, I heard of a case where an employee made a wrong entry in their records and vice versa. So let me talk about the employer. The employer made a wrong record about the date of birth and therefore by extension, the date of retirement. So in the records, the employer made a mistake of recording the date of employment and the retirement date. So according to the employee, he or she was still on the payroll. But according to the employer, this person should be out of employment. This created a sort of conflict, and this can lead to litigation if the employer decides that this person should go. The employer will claim unfair dismissal, employee, sorry, will claim unfair dismissal, and that can lead to a long litigation process, which is costly in terms of money and time. So records like health records should be secure, salaries should be secure, family records regard the number of children and even wives or husbands should be secure. And then in terms of confidentiality, that this record should be kept in a way that nobody accesses them and can use them in other ways. So confidentiality has to do with divulging information to other third parties, compared to security, which talks about safety of records, free from theft and manipulation. So managers have a duty to ensure that the information or data they collect from their employees is kept confidential. Lack of confidentiality has consequences, and shortly we will be looking at the consequences of not complying with any of the laws that I have mentioned. Perhaps I can ask a question to that end, whether anybody has a question in relation to the areas covered, but I must give a disclaimer that these are not the only areas that are covered under the labor laws. There are many, but I only picked the important ones for purposes of this presentation. So the floor is open. Anybody with a question can ask. And if there's no question, we can proceed. Anybody with a question? Okay. If there's no question, I will assume that we are all clear about the areas covered by the various labor laws. And therefore, I will move to the next slide, and that is key compliance areas. I have mentioned before that hiring and onboarding is part of recruitment and selection. When we hire people, we are bringing them on board through a process of recruitment and selection. And for that reason, care should be taken that we comply with the requirements of the Employment Act when we are hiring our people. And I've mentioned fair hiring practices. I will mention a few others. One is transparency and accountability. That the information we collect from our prospective employees should be treated with utmost care of transparency and accountability. That our advertisements should also be transparent, that there should be no anything hidden behind the advertisements. Why? Because when people join organizations, they have certain expectations based on the advertisements that they saw. And when they don't see this, they will feel that they have been conned or they have been shortchanged. And there are consequences to that. Secondly, I mentioned that fairness and equity should be promoted during hiring, that equal opportunity should be given to the employees, and again, without exception, and that the data that we obtain is protected. Secondly, on wage and compensation, I've mentioned adherence to the minimum wages and overtime pay, workplace safety and health. Health and safety standards must always be promoted. I've talked about employee rights and benefits, paid leave related to annual leave and sick leave for a period of time, social security like NSSF, and any other statutory deductions like SHA are all benefits that we should comply with as part of the requirements of the labor laws. And then another one is termination of contract. And here we are talking about lawful dismissal procedures and severance packages. I want to talk about dismissal a little bit. That dismissal is termination of a contract before its intended period of time expires. That a person can be dismissed on account of the following. Number one is indiscipline. Number two is poor performance, which we should be very careful about. Those two are the main reasons why dismissals are undertaken. When you talk of dismissal on account of indiscipline, here we are talking about several types of indiscipline, which we can classify into two. Number one is minor indiscipline, which are misdemeanors. And the number two is major indiscipline, which is also called gross misconduct. I can mention a few types of gross misconduct, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with, and they are provided for in the Employment Act. Number one is theft. Number two is harassment. Number three is sabotage. Number four is fighting and causing bodily harm. And number five, it accumulates, absenteeism from work. I believe you are all aware that the Employment Act does not provide the period of absence from the organization. It just says that anybody who is absent from work without lawful excuse can be dismissed. That is under summary dismissal. However, it is the responsibility of the employer to develop policies to guide on this key aspect of absenteeism. In all fairness, if a person is absent from work for 1 day, that should not be a reason for dismissal. There could be reasons why he or she may not attend work, but the policy should provide the maximum number of days which an employee can be absent for a disciplinary action to be taken against him or her. So lawful dismissal arises from indiscipline and performance. So when you talk about performance, this is where an employee perennially underperforms or performs poorly. In our policies, we are guided by the minimum scores that an employee should meet for them to remain in employment. So anything below the prescribed standard in the policy is said to be poor performance. And again, depending on your policy, this poor performance can be 3 cycles. A cycle can be 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. So if a person does not perform in 3 cycles, then they may be dismissed as provided for in your policies. However, we should be very careful with terminating or dismissing employees on account of poor performance. Why? Because the employer has a duty to prove that it is the employee who failed to perform. That means that we should do everything possible under the sun to ensure that we have supported the employee to improve their performance. Otherwise, you don't expect an employee to perform well if you don't provide tools and equipment, if the environment is not supportive, if the colleagues or co-workers are not supportive, or if there is a lot of work and it can be proved that there is a lot of work which led to poor performance. So there is a whole lot of things and responsibilities that the employer should be engaged in before terminating a person on account of performance. And then next is severance package. This is the payment an employee is given upon termination of employment contract. I'll mention 3 or 4. Number 1 is any pending leave days. Number 2, any salaries and the benefits owed. And number 3 is gratuity, if it is provided for in your policies. These are all entitlements of the employees under the Employment Act, which must be complied with. And again, I must restate that these are not the only areas of compliance. There are many. So it is for us to also read around and about this so that we have a clear understanding of what these compliance areas are and what we are required as managers to ensure compliance. What is the importance of complying before we look at the consequences? Number one is prevent legal disputes and lawsuits. Legal disputes. These are differences between the employer and the employees. These differences or conflicts arise from the employment relationship. They arise from the employment relationship. And how do they arise? They arise out of non-compliance. That there are aspects like the ones that we have mentioned, which are provided for, but the employers or the employees choose not to obey them. So when you talk of legal disputes, they may relate to, and I can mention about 4 aspects that may relate to legal disputes. Number 1, illegal deductions. That an employer deducts money from the employees' wages or salaries, which are not provided for in law. We all know the statutory deductions like SHA, housing levy, NSSF, and payee. Those are the ones that are regulatory, statutory. So anything outside this can be considered illegal and therefore can rise to a dispute. Number 2, poor working conditions or environment. In organizations where there are many accidents or many illnesses arising from the job environment, employees can go on strike to ensure that their health and safety is guaranteed. So poor working environment can lead to a legal dispute. And I have mentioned that this is covered under the Health and Safety Act, as well as Work Injuries and Benefits Act. Another area of dispute is discrimination. Discrimination in relation to recruitment, training, compensation and benefits, as well as dispute handling. So this aspect where employees feel discriminated against because of the poor working environment, then the employee might go to court to seek legal redress. So what are we saying in regard to compliance of labor laws? that our labor laws are clear on the rights and obligations of the employees and the employers. And based on these provisions, and if they are complied with, then there will be minimal legal disputes, minimal. I'm not saying that there will never be disputes. We shall reduce the numbers. And one of the measures of success during the HR audit is looking at the number of disputes that have arisen, the number of disputes resolved, and the number of lawsuits that have been presented before a court of law. So a HR manager can be dancing in happiness because they have complied with all the legal requirements and thus reducing the costs related to the disputes that we have mentioned. So by and large, compliance with the law helps to prevent those legal disputes. And how do we prevent them? It is by complying. Number two, I've talked about retention. That when we comply with the labor laws, the possibility of retaining most of our employees is very high. And again, I said, employment laws are there to provide a framework within which the employer and the employee operate, so that there is no infringement of people's rights and obligations. So if an organization is managed or run on the principles of 1, equity, 2, fairness, 3, transparency, and 4, accountability, then chances of retaining employees are very high. And like I said earlier, a satisfied employee is likely to remain in an organization. So when the principles of fairness, equity, transparency, and accountability are practiced, then employees may be engaged and remain in the organization. So the labor laws provide the groundwork and the framework for the behavior of both the managers and employees. And this helps to retain those employees that we want to remain. Thirdly, compliance with the labor laws promotes a positive organizational reputation. And again, this relates to the employer brand, the image of the organization. Even at a personal level, we want to be regarded highly among our friends or in society. And for us to be regarded highly, we must behave in a manner that is in compliance with the ethical standards of society. The same applies to the organization, that the managers and the employees must behave in a manner that is compliant with the law and in a manner that is ethical. When this is done and seen to be implemented, even outsiders will see this. And this will promote the employer brand. The name of the organization will reverberate in the community and even beyond, because the managers promote fair and equitable labor practices. And we all want to work with such organizations where our rights are protected and the environment in which we operate is conducive. So all these protections are enshrined in the labor laws so that there is no unfair discrimination or discrimination at all. There is fair promotion, fair treatment of all employees. So compliance with the labor laws helps to build that reputation, a name that we want to build. And again, let me emphasize, a reputable organization is one that complies with the law, 2, treats their employees fairly, 3, creates a conducive environment, and 4, protects the environment in which they operate. And all this has to do with compliance with the law. Number 4 is ensure workplace fairness and equity. This again throws us back to the concept of non-discrimination. And again, I want to talk about the various forms of discrimination because they all address the aspect of fairness and equity. 1, gender discrimination. 2, racial discrimination. 3, ethnic or tribal discrimination. And 5, sexual orientation. Again, I'm sure many of us are trying to wrap our minds around the concept of LGBTQ.
Mwalimu, come again on the discriminations.
Discrimination, I'll mention them again. 1, gender discrimination. 2, racial discrimination. 3, ethnic or tribal discrimination. And number 4 is sexual orientation. I guess we are together, Siama?
Yes, we are. We may proceed now. Thank you.
Thank you. I was addressing myself to the concept of LGBTQ, which we are all trying to understand, and if it becomes law, how we are going to address it. Although it is not officially legal for people in the LGBTQ category in an organization, this is something that is coming very soon. And because of that, our policies should read equal opportunity employment to promote fairness and equity. Allow me to give an example of a case which happened here in Kenya, where a manager or a supervisor is invited by a junior staff to go for a birthday party. Both of them are men. And because of their good relationship and friendliness or friendship, the manager agrees to attend the birthday party. And this party is conducted in a hotel. So the people present made merry, and everybody went their way. The manager or supervisor woke up in the morning in a strange room, which he has never been to. And it looked like a hotel room. He wondered what had happened to him, but he realized that he had been sodomized. He was very afraid to talk about this in the organization. He was not even sure whether to go to court because of his name. He was also afraid because his family will doubt him, and many other feelings that he may have had. I understand that this person committed suicide because of this. So what am I saying? LGBTQ is real. And if we pretend that it is not there, it might come soon. And again, the earlier we start preparing for this, the better. So labor laws ensure workplace fairness and equity because they provide the standards and the framework for both the employer and the employees. Then another importance is the reduction of the risks of fines and penalties. And again, I will talk about this in the next slide. That is the consequences of non-compliance. So the last point down there is that it promotes sustainability and the growth of business. What do I mean by sustainability? It means continuous operation for a long time, and that the business is able to support itself without dying. A business may die in many ways. One, mismanagement. Two, new laws that are very hard to comply. Three, legal suits. Speaking of legal suits, an organization can be fined heavily, running into billions or millions. And if the business is not able to pay the fine, then the employee might file for bankruptcy, that the employer is not able to pay its obligations. So what we are saying, that an organization can continue surviving if it complies with all the laws, because employees have a right to go to courts and seek redress or compensation. Speaking of growth, Growth is an expansion of an organization. And organizations can expand in three ways. One, in terms of revenues, money. Two, in terms of markets. That is the customer base. And three, in terms of products. So I've mentioned three types of growth. One, revenue growth or profits. Two, customers. And three, products. The question is, who are the people responsible for this growth or expansion? It is the employees. So if the employees are not treated well in terms of fairness and equity, one, they cannot perform. Two, they can exit. And three, they can sue the employer rather. They can sue. And that is where growth is affected. That suppose the employees who are exiting and suing the organization are the productive or innovative ones. What happens to the growth? The organization stagnates. It cannot grow. And it cannot attract people from outside for it to grow. So with the big fines and the compensations that employees are given, an organization may not grow as fast as it intended, and some may even decline and eventually die because of non-compliance. So if employers take keen interest in the various areas covered under the employment law, then they are likely to ensure that their organizations grow and are sustainable in the long term. So those are the key points that help us to understand the importance of compliance with the various law and the legal provisions that I have mentioned. Moving forward, I want us to look at the role of HR managers in this compliance aspect. So what is your role and mine as HR practitioners in ensuring that we comply with the labor laws? Number one is to monitor and update HR policies on a regular basis. What do I mean by monitoring? It is a process of collecting data, making observations, and assessing the effectiveness of HR policies and practices. Observing, assessing or evaluating, or collecting data. So when we do this, we are likely to identify three things. Through monitoring, we can identify three things. Number one, areas of strength. Remember, we talked about tools for HR audit, one of which was the SWOT analysis. So strengths. These are areas in which we are doing very well in relation to gaps. These are areas in which we are not doing well. And these are the areas which we need to focus on because of the need for compliance. That is areas of weakness. And lastly, number three, out of monitoring, we identify opportunities for improvement. Again, yesterday we talked about improvement, and we said that we need to identify those touch points and opportunities in the market that we can take advantage of. So I want to zero in on the gaps so that as HR managers, we shall ensure compliance. These gaps can be found in our policies, processes, and practices related to the various HR activities like recruitment and selection, training and development, performance management, employee relations, as well as compensation and benefits. So we take a toothpick and carefully scrutinize our policies, our procedures and practices to pick out those gray areas which need to be improved. And once we have identified those areas, then we update. Update by doing three things. One, elimination. Two, modify. And three, change. So we eliminate, modify, or change those policies, practices, or processes that are offending the law. Offending the law. That is where the gaps are. And I said we take a toothpick and pick them out and then update them. So when we update, we are on the safer side of the law. And that works to our benefit because our businesses will grow, sustainability will be guaranteed, and employees will remain in our organizations, just like the importance that we have covered in the previous slide. And this can be done regularly. Without losing sight of our training, we are saying that by monitoring and updating, you are auditing compliance. So let us not lose sight of that, auditing compliance. You remember we said at the beginning that there are several types of compliance. One, functional compliance. Two, legal compliance. Three, strategic compliance. And four, we talked about environmental compliance, among others. So when we monitor and update our policies, we are ensuring that we comply with the legal aspects of employment relationship. And that is part of our audit. So this audit process should not start and end at a particular time. It should be continuous. Why should it be continuous? Because our environment changes. The laws change. And that is why we need to have an office which monitors changes in the legal environment and ensuring that we are updated properly. Number two, another role of HR managers is training our employees on compliance. A lot of time is usually spent on training employees in relation to their performance. Because as it were, training is intended to identify performance gaps and therefore improve employee performance. Has been spent by employers to train employees on compliance. And that means that we'll run the risk of non-compliance because employees are not aware of the standards applicable. So we should create a budget for training employees on aspects of compliance. And again, I'm inviting you to come to our training on the 3rd of March through the 7th to talk about one of a major compliance issue, and that is data protection. That in this course, we shall look at the compliance standards according to the Data Protection Act 2019. So we should train our employees on compliance, particularly on aspects to do with recruitment, to do with compensation, and to do with the work environment. Because this is where most of the disputes arise from. Matters to do with discrimination, unfairness, and equity. And the law provides the procedures. All the laws provide procedures, and that is why we need to understand those procedures. And if need be, we can train our employees by the Kenya Bureau of Standards, like ISO 9001, on matters to do with quality. That even if we are in HR, quality is a cross-cutting issue, that it should be ensured in all departments, whether you are in a manufacturing or service industry. So we train our employees for purposes of compliance. You can train in-house or externally, depending on availability of resources and also expertise. So if the experts are within, you can share their knowledge within, or invite somebody to come and train you within, or go outside by way of visits to the various regulatory bodies, or even the ministry, so that we can learn about this. And then number 3, our role as HR managers is to address compliance violations. Violations are breaches that either individuals, groups, or the organization violates or breaches a legal requirement. This must be addressed promptly. Promptly means immediately or without delay. These violations can lead to fines or other consequences like closure of business. So as HR managers, and because we monitor our level of compliance, we should be able to address those compliance violations immediately. Another role is implement reporting mechanisms for misconduct. Our role as managers are always preventive in nature. We don't want to wait until something happens, and that is when we take action. We need to, on a regular basis, monitor, like I said in bullet 1, monitor what is happening around us. If it is recruitment, we monitor how we are doing that. Are there violations? If it's training, we monitor. If it is payment, we monitor. And through monitoring, we prepare reports. These reports should be shared among employees so that we are on top of our game by highlighting areas of misconduct which should be addressed immediately. So misconduct is not only about employees, it can also be about managers or employers. They can unfairly terminate a person, that is a form of misconduct. And if we cannot address it through the channels within the organization, employees will always go to court to ensure compliance. And that is why we have courts giving orders either of reinstatement or payment of the employee because of a violation. So those reports that we generate when undertaking various processes like recruitment and selection should be able to identify any violations, and then the violations are rectified immediately. The other role is working with the legal teams to ensure that our policies, practices, and processes are aligned. Like I have mentioned before, legal teams provide expertise. Because as HR managers, we are not experts in law. So the lawyers who in some companies are called company secretaries are there to advise the organization and in particular the HR department on matters related to employment relationship. So if a manager tells you to dismiss a person because they don't like their face, please don't dismiss them because you know the law. Or if you are not sure of what is to be done, please look for a legal expert within. This expert will be able to advise you. Another expert who should be a member of this legal team is the employee relations expert. This is a person who has been trained and qualified to handle matters related to employment relationship. That's why he or she is called employee relations manager. He or she is in a better position to advise you as a HR manager. Probably we are HR generalists. But if you have a specialist in the form of employee relations expert, this is a person that you should be able to contact so that you ensure that your policies are aligned with the labor laws. So if you don't have an internal legal team, you can also hire an external legal expert who can come to look at your policies, or if not, you can consult them so that they can advise you on areas of concern that you are not sure about. And then the last role is ethical and inclusive work environment. Ethical. These are social standards that are acceptable in an organization or society. Acceptable. The key word there, acceptable standards. And again, as they say that whatever has been accepted on earth, it's also acceptable even in heaven. So if ethical standards are acceptable ways of behavior, then HR managers should be at the forefront of promoting these ethical standards. What are the ethical issues that we are talking about here? I can talk about 2 or 3, which in some way I've already talked about. Number 1, honesty and integrity. That we should learn to tell the truth and behave in a manner that brings honor and respect to our office. That is number 1. I repeat, honesty and integrity. Number 2, ethical issue number 2 is confidentiality. That we should keep information related to employment confidential, that it should not be given to third parties. So confidentiality is very key as an ethical issue. Number 3, an ethical issue is transparency and accountability. Transparency. That there should be no information that is kept under the carpet or in our drawers, which is useful to others in our team or the organization. Transparency promotes trust, and trust promotes performance. So without confidentiality, then people are not sure whether information should be given and what use will it be made of. Ethical issue number 4 is fairness and equity, which we have already mentioned. If I may say, these ethical standards are derived from our core values. Core values. Values are the aspects that we consider to be important for success. And I've mentioned those core values like honesty and integrity, transparency, fairness, among others. So these ethical standards promote compliance. And allow me to emphasize, all laws in the world, including ours, are based on ethics, ethical standards. That whatever the law provides for is ethical. It is good for humanity. And as it were, all laws are meant to promote fairness and equity. All laws in the world are promoting fairness and equity. And if as HR managers we can promote fairness and equity, then compliance becomes very easy. The other aspect that we should promote is inclusive work environment. Inclusive. That nobody should be left out in decision-making processes. Everybody's opinion, viewpoint, or ideas matter. If I may quote one of the greatest strategies in the world, he says that strategy is a weed, or it's like a weed. It grows anywhere and everywhere. And I'm using the words of Peter Drucker as one of the greatest strategic HR managers that ever lived. So by including everybody in decision-making, we are agreeing with Drucker that people from any quarter, at any level, have ideas, have views, have opinions that can help improve the organization. And therefore, there should be no discrimination in our policies and practices. And again, the law provides that there should be no discrimination. And that is the essence of developing policies on inclusivity. I may want to take us back to what I mentioned yesterday and the other day concerning this concept of DEI. D standing for diversity. E standing for equity. And I standing for inclusivity. These three concepts go together, that in diversity, we celebrate our differences. In equity, we give people from diverse backgrounds equal opportunities. And in inclusivity, everybody, irrespective of their background, participate in the decision-making. Why do we need to promote this inclusive work environment? One is to increase the chances of innovation. So when people contribute their ideas, we promote innovation. 2, inclusivity promotes engagement, that employees identify with the organization and want to work with it. And then number 3, reduce turnover. Turnover is expensive, and employees who feel like they don't matter and that their ideas do not count, they are likely to leave. So inclusivity is such an important aspect that as HR managers, we should promote at all times. So those are the few examples of the role of HR in complying with the labor laws, compliance. And again, we don't want to lose the concept of compliance because our topic for today was compliance and implementation strategies. So once we have complied, we need to implement our report. So what are the consequences of non-compliance? Sorry. I'll go over them fairly quickly because we have mentioned some of them. One is fines as one of the penalties, and the fines can go into thousands, if not millions of shillings. Why are fines a negative consequence? Because it is costly. The money that we pay in the form of fines are very high. For example, in the Data Act, if an employer is found guilty of contravening the Data Act, they are liable to 1 million shillings or even more. In other jurisdictions, it's over 20 million. So fines are expensive. We want to avoid those consequences by ensuring that we comply. Then the other aspect of penalty is lawsuits, where employees go to court to seek legal redress. Lawsuits are again expensive in terms of time and money. I am sure those of us in the HR department have found ourselves in the corridors of courts trying to defend the organization for what they did. Probably it wasn't your mistake, but because somebody did an offense, either unknowingly or knowingly. And this wastes a lot of your time in the corridors of justice. So lawsuits are expensive in terms of time. Your time and the time of the organization. They're also expensive because of productivity and performance. So employers who are in court, like the legal experts in your organization, or you as a HR manager, you are in court. You stop work and go to attend court cases. That becomes expensive. And then another cost related to lawsuit is money. The money you are using to go to court is not your money, it's the organization's money. And the cases can drag for years because of postponement and other issues. So you spend organizational money traveling to and from law courts because of an offense that was committed. So we should be aware of our actions because there are legal penalties. The other consequence is the reputation, where the brand name is lost, nobody trusts the organization anymore. How does this come about? One, unfair termination, which is unlawful. Two, discrimination, where people who belong, and I emphasize belong, are the ones who are given jobs or promoted. Three, poor working conditions, which is a violation of the OSHA and the WIBA. Or four, unfair practices. This lead to loss of trust from the employees and the public in general. If we want to attract people, we need to protect our reputation. And that is why compliance with all the labor laws is not a choice that we make, but a must. Another consequence is employee turnover and lower productivity. I have talked about higher turnover in many instances before. And again, I want to talk about it. This is about exit of employees. When employees exit, they exit with 3 or 4 things. Number one, their skills and knowledge. When you talk about tacit knowledge, this is a type of knowledge that resides in the mind of employees. When they live with it. So they live with skills and knowledge. And if they have not been shared, the organization loses. Number two, they go with their experience. And as it is argued, nothing can replace experience. And some could say, take it to the bank. Nothing can replace experience. Yes, people can learn, but experienced people produce results. So they live with their experience. And then number three, they also live with their innovation and creativity. Innovation. Entrepreneurs and business champions argue that if you stop innovating, you start dying. So you can imagine what will happen to your organization if the employees are living with their innovation. Then the organization starts dying. Because there are no new ideas, no new products, no new systems, no new processes. You stagnate, start declining, and eventually you die. So one of the consequences of non-compliance is employee turnover, which I have said is a cost, and they can leave because of non-compliance. And the matters to do with health and safety, which are not complied with, matters to do with compensation, not complied with, matters to do with the discrimination, not complied with. So if employees perceive inequity and unfairness because the labor laws have not been complied with, they leave. And that is why we need to be worried and concerned about employee leaving the organization. So if your turnover is more than 15%, then you have every reason to be concerned. On the part of productivity, this is what employees produce over time. the results and outcomes and what they produce over time. So productivity is a measure that we use to determine the success of HR managers. So when we audit legal compliance, we are focusing on how we can ensure that employees produce desired results in an environment that is fair, just, equitable, and non-discriminative. All these are factors that are covered in the employment law. So productivity is affected by non-compliance. The other aspect is regulatory audits and investigations. I want to give an example of a person who was working with an international organization. And this is an article that I read this morning. That the person has been declaring nil returns. Being an employee of an international organization, they are not taxed. But unfortunately, this employee had invested here in Kenya in real estate and still declaring nil returns to KRA. So KRA developed suspicion on why this employee is declaring nil returns and yet there are properties in his name. So they went to audit his accounts and investigated, only to find that he has property and he has been declaring nil returns. And what has happened? He has been fined about 32 million shillings for non-compliance. So when we conduct our business as HR managers, we should know that there are consequences. That if there is anything unbecoming in your organization, the Ministry of Labor may start conducting audits and investigations to find out what is happening. And if you are found guilty, the other consequence is lawsuit and fines. And then financial loss, I've mentioned fines in bullet 1. Money can be lost because of compensation claims, legal fees, and the disruption. I don't want to belabor the point because that is clear. And lastly, down there, we have loss of business licenses and permits, where if you are found guilty, your licenses and permits can be terminated, which means that the business closes down. And without licenses, you know that you are operating illegally. Any business that illegally operating should be closed. And the closures may arise from non-compliance. I know you know that in Kenya there are cases where organizations are closed for health and safety reasons. I remember some time ago, a bus company had its licenses suspended for so many accidents. Not one, not two, not three, but many. So the Ministry of Transport, through NTSA, which is an agency of government, suspended the license, which means that the business made losses before the suspension was lifted. So the investigations were done to determine whether it was the buses which were faulty or not repaired or not serviced, or maybe it was the employees, particularly the drivers, who are not qualified or under the influence of drugs or were overworked. So again, this is an example of non-compliance where you may have your licenses and the permits suspended or even terminated completely because of non-compliance. Probably some of us are legal experts, and you know that if you don't comply with the requirements of a legal expert, you may have your license struck off the legal practice list. And this can be done by LSK. The Law Society of Kenya can suspend your permit, you can suspend your license as an individual or as an organization. So again, we need to be careful in regard to compliance. And that is why audits are very important. Compliance audit to determine areas where we have deficiencies and making regular updates to ensure that we don't suffer all these consequences. So next is how can we identify gaps? There are many ways of identifying gaps. And maybe I can ask a question after I've gone through the compliance checklist. One is reviewing our policies on a regular basis to ensure that they are aligned with the labor laws. And I am happy we are attending this course because it's about audit. We are going to audit our policies to ensure that they are compliant. So when you audit policies, you identify gaps, and from those gaps, we can take remedial or corrective measures. Number two, we conduct interviews. Though we said that interviews are part of this audit, but in some cases we may need to conduct employee surveys. Why? To obtain the views of the employees with regard to the various practices and the policies that are against the law. So in these interviews can be done either during onboarding, 2, during the time employees are working, and 3, during employee exits. Talking of exits, we all know that employees may leave for any reason, one of which is non-compliance with the labor laws, where you are talking about discrimination, unfairness, and the violation of the labor laws. So exit interviews can help us to obtain insights on what is happening and then take corrective measures. So interviews are a way of identifying compliance gaps. The third way of identifying gaps is analyzing data by way of auditing records, payrolls, and training logs to identify any gaps. Employee records should be accurate. They should be adequate. They should be legal. And they should be up to date. I repeat, they should be accurate. They should be adequate. And 3, they should be legal. Anything that violates the Data Act, especially with regard to data, is illegal. So records that are outdated means that they may violate the law. Records that are inadequate, meaning that there are aspects that are left out, and these aspects could be compliance issues. And 3, records that are not accurate, meaning that they are not factual based on law. So that becomes a compliance issue. So when you analyze your data, looking at the documents that you have in your custody, you should be able to identify gaps. You also audit the payroll systems, particularly with regard to the statutory deductions. We should be compliant, that government comes first, that we should start deducting all the deductions as required by law before any other deductions. What some employers do, especially for employees who have loans, is they release the loans from the payroll and ask the employees to sort themselves out. And lastly, we talk about training logs. These are records of all the trainings that we undertake. And training is also regulated under the Training Act. And for your information, for anybody to be compensated or reimbursed money, the organization should be certified by NITA. That is National Industrial Training Authority. And this facilitates trainings in organizations and the types of trainings that can be offered. How else can we identify gaps? Number 4 is benchmarking. I remember we talked about benchmarking, which means comparing ourselves with the best of class in the industry. We can compare ourselves in terms of policies, secondly, practices, and lastly, processes. These are the aspects that create a culture of compliance. So when we do benchmarks, we can compare ourselves with more than 2 organizations, so that 1, we identify best practices, and 2, we identify industry trends. I repeat, 1, identify trends, and 2, we identify industry practices. So these are key, because through these benchmarks, we are looking at the best practices. And organizations that are successful and with which we are benchmarking comply with the law. So when you do benchmarking, you identify gaps, particularly related to compliance, and that gives us insights on areas that we can improve. The other one is checking all our documents related to employment. And our first point of call is the employment records. Records related to the date of employment, payment, disciplinary processes, as well as promotions and others. So if you check your records and you find that, for example, an employee has stagnated in one position for a long time, then you should ask yourself why. That is a gap. Are you compliant? Compliant with 2 things. 1, your own policies on promotion. And 2, the labor laws. on the understanding that the labor laws promote fairness and equity, it is not fair for an employee to stagnate in one position for a long time. And that is why we need to check our documents to see the last time employees were promoted and who could be left out. Then lastly, we can identify compliance by engaging experts. These are consultants who could be HR consultants or legal consultants. Because of their industry experience and expertise, they may be able to identify gaps which we may not easily identify. Sometimes when we do self-audit, there are some instances where we miss out on certain things. But when we bring in a second eye in the form of an expert, they are able to point out gaps that can become areas of improvement because we want to comply. So what are these gaps that we should identify? Allow me to mention all of them very quickly. Outdated employment contracts and policies. That these documents have a shelf life, that they expire with time. For example, an employment contract can expire. For example, fixed term contract expires. If it expires and an employer does not inform the employee about renewal, then that is a gap. An employee can continue working and continue being paid against the contract. Before you realize it, an employee has earned salaries for 5-6 months, and that's when you realize that there is a big mistake, and what you can only do is to renew the contract automatically because it becomes a rolling contract. In terms of policies, it's a good practice to review our policies after every 3 or 4 years. Why such a long time? One, to allow for implementation, and two, to allow for stability. So we review our policies on a regular basis. If policies are not reviewed, then it becomes a gap because some policies may not be compliant. For example, suppose your policies have not been reviewed and the new laws like SHIF and SHA have already started being implemented. That becomes a big legal gap, which we have no excuse of defending. Secondly is non-compliance with minimum wages. I've talked about minimum wages, where it's a legal requirement that we maintain those wages. Otherwise, we might be sued. Harassment and prevention policies and training are other gaps. And I'm sure your policies are comprehensive in terms of harassment, that you define what harassment is, forms or types of harassment, consequences of harassment, and the legal provisions of harassment. Because harassment is a very serious legal offense, which falls under gross misconduct. And it's provided for in the Employment Act 2007. So harassment might be in the form of looking or ogling, touching or texting, sending text, or violating somebody's space. This must be defined in our policies. So if there are many complaints in an organization related to harassment, then that is a gap. And any gender can harass another, whether it is female or male, they can be harassed. Or have managers harassing each other, or employees harassing others, or vice versa. Then another one is health and safety standards, which are poorly maintained. That is a gap. I've talked about health and safety standards like ventilation, lighting, cleanliness, provision of clean and drinking water, provision of protective gear, and regular audits. These are all required under the health and safety standards. The second last one is employee performance. As I said, that terminating employees on account of performance is a moot issue. Moot in the sense that it's very dicey, that you can easily fall into the trap of unfair dismissal. So if it's not well structured, meaning that it does not provide all the requirements for a person to perform to expected standards, then that becomes a gap. And then lastly is weak protection of data, that our systems expose employees' personal data, like date of birth, number of children, health records, salaries and wages, among other private issues. That means that there is a gap in policy and the protection of data. So as we leave this training today, I believe that we are going to have an audit of what we do in practice and what we have learned, and identify gaps as well, because trainings also help to identify gaps. So to that end, I want to invite questions before we move on to the next and perhaps last part of this series of training. Any question? Okay, it seems that there is no question, because silence means that there is no question. I want us to move to the second last aspect. That is, how do we sustain and ensure that we comply with the best practices? I said, and that is what I mentioned earlier on, if I may go back here, identifying compliance gaps is to review policies. So regular policy updates will help us to identify gaps and also develop best practices that can help us to comply. Regular policy updates. And I have said you can update or review your policies after every 3 or 4 years. Beyond 4 years, that is very long. The law might have changed, or the environment has also changed. So as part of our adaptation and agility, we need to update our policies. Secondly, we create awareness through training. That is, we educate our staff on their duties and responsibilities in relation to the legal practices. By training them, we reduce instances of violation so that everybody does not have an excuse of saying that I didn't know. And because the law is an us, it kicks, it has no provision for ignorance. The law does not say that if you didn't know, then it becomes legal. No. You are supposed to know. So how are we supposed to make sure that employees know the laws and regulations? We train them. And if not training, we create awareness through communication. So communication is a form of creating awareness. Another one is conduct audit compliance, and this is why we are here. We will go back and conduct HR audit to identify areas in which we are not compliant. Second last is transparency and reporting mechanisms. Those records must be clear and understood to everybody. Starting with employment contracts. There should be no clauses in the contract that violate the law. Secondly, the employment policies. They should not be violating the laws, and therefore employees should be given copies for them to familiarize themselves with. The last one is engaging legal experts, like I have said, whether internal or external. They are able to advise us or give us direction on any aspect that seem to violate the labor laws. This is closely related to what we have said, sustaining compliance and best practices. This one here is talking about compliance strategy. That whatever plans that we have developed out of non-compliance, we need to implement them. So how do we sustain these strategies? One is assigning compliance roles. I said that if you want to succeed in the modern day organization, you create teams. So assign roles to various teams like employee relations office or the legal office to ensure that we sustain this compliance. Two, we must always have a compliance checklist, which is lifted from the labor laws. Whether it's Employment Act, pick those legal requirements. If it is Health and Safety Act, pick them. If it is WIBA, pick others. So that you are on the safe side, because if you have a tick, boxes to tick and audit what you have ticked, then you will ensure a sustainable compliance strategy. Monitoring and tracking is about regular collection of data and evaluation on the degree or the level of compliance. Because our environment is dynamic, we need to monitor and track compliance. The other aspect, like I have said, is engaging legal experts. And then another important aspect, which is bullet 6, is bullet 5 rather, encouraging employee feedback, where we interview employees or give them questionnaires in regard to our HR policies and practices. This feedback should be acted on because they show gaps in compliance. And lastly, as a good management practice, accountability and transparency is very important. So I don't need to overemphasize that. I want to look at how do we communicate audit findings. Now that we have come a full cycle, We have identified the objectives of audit. We have identified the challenges. We have identified the strategies. We have identified compliance issues. And now we want to communicate those findings. These findings are usually in the form of a report, which we can present to the relevant authorities, either for ratification or for implementation. So they should be presented in a clear and actionable manner. Clear because they are understandable, actionable because they can be implemented. And again, you remember we mentioned that one of the aspects of prioritization is feasibility. How practical is it to implement the findings? So if the findings cannot be supported by the current resources, then they are not actionable. Then we need to use data visualization. This is the use of graphics, such as pie charts, flow charts, or in some cases, line graphs. Some of us don't understand the words and the paragraphs. We understand graphs better than tons of paragraphs. So these charts are a summary of what is being said in the report. So how do we ensure that we communicate effectively? Is by way of customizing our messages. Customize because we want to tailor-make the messages to suit the different stakeholders. One, the executives, they may not need the whole report. You will only need to pick the key issues because the report can be hundreds of pages. The chief executives don't have that time. And even when you are writing your board paper, you should not go there with details. Summarize these findings and present them in a clear and actionable manner. Secondly, the HR team, pick out operational issues that are key to the HR team and highlight them. Because at the end of it, you are the people who are expected to implement these HR audit findings. And lastly, the employees. Not all things that have been found in the audit are useful for employees. Anything that is sensitive and should only be consumed by executives and other managers, we need to develop a blind copy, which is meant for employees only. So that is what I can say about communication. I didn't want to go through the process of how you communicate, where you communicate, because that's a whole topic on communication. Second last is how do we ensure that all the stakeholders accept the findings? Number one, you explain the benefits of complying, particularly to the chief executives or the leaders of the organization. Benefits. Like we said, we do a cost-benefit analysis, and if the benefits are more than the costs, then we implement. So we explain these benefits. Secondly, involve all the stakeholders, because we have said that one of the principles and the legal requirements is inclusivity. So let the decision makers be included in this process. Any issues that may arise, such as resistance or violations, should be addressed promptly. So as HR managers, people can only accept what we are trying to implement if any arising concerns are addressed. Then Again, don't forget the positive side. It's not all gloom and doom. Where there are areas where employees have performed very well, highlight them, because this can form part of motivation because we have performed well. Don't focus only on the gaps, but also identify cases where employees have performed very well and then compliment them. If possible, you reward them. Then second last, cost benefit analysis, which I've said that if the benefits are more than the costs, then that is a good process which we should engage in. And that when we audit this aspects, whether it's functional audit, strategic audit, or legal audit, it is beneficial to everybody. And then again, need not to emphasize the principle of transparency, that is openness and accountability. Lastly is leading by example. And as they say, we must learn to walk the talk. That we must do what we say. And we must mean what we say. That by leading by example, you be the first one to do what you require others to do. If it's reporting to work, be the example, you report there on time. If it's about discipline, demonstrate discipline because you lead by example, so that we don't point fingers. Like it has been reported in other circles that we have failed in our duties as parents. So we are the parents of the organization as HR managers, we must lead by example. How do we implement changes after the audit? One, we develop a detailed action plan where we are identifying 5 key things. One is the recommendation. 2, the person responsible. 3, the outcomes expected. 4, the resources required. And 5, the timelines. That is a detailed plan of action. Number 2, test the programs before full implementation. Why we are failing or facing challenges in SHA is because we did not pilot it. Or if it was done, it was a small pilot test. If we want to fail in this process, we directly replace the old system with the current system. The first thing maybe you need to do before you implement is to look at the current audit systems. What do you have? And then what are the new audits or gaps that you have identified? Then implement them along the previous ones. That's what is called parallel implementation. And then you pilot this because you never know the outcomes because of the attendant protests or resistance. Then provide training and support because some of the recommendations contained in this report may require people to understand how things are done. So you train them. Lastly, ensure labor laws compliance. And that is what we have taken a lot of time to explain here. Lastly, set realistic timeline. And that is borrowed from the objectives that we started. Objectives must be SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. So when you talk of timeliness, we are looking at the time it takes to implement the recommendations that we have developed from our audits. And lastly, before I open the floor, is building a culture of continuous improvement. I have already mentioned the best practices that we should embrace. One, promote innovation and adaptability, that we should be agile by way of regular updates. So if we regularly update our policies and practices, then we are building a culture of continuous improvement. Secondly, we reward and recognize teams, especially teams that are involved in initiatives that ensure compliance and promote good practices. Recognition and rewards, which could be financial or non-financial. Again, let me caution that you don't increase people's salaries because of an innovation or because of a practice, because that will mean that everybody should have his or her salaries increased, and especially in a team environment. Another way of building a culture of continuous improvement is collaboration across various teams and departments. Through these collaborations, we always achieve synergy. Synergy are the better or more results that we derive from working as a team. Nobody succeeds working alone. And as they say, if you want to go far, walk alone. If you want to go the farthest, work in a team. So in team environment, we promote a culture of improvement because we get insights from different stakeholders. And the second last is to update our policies and procedures on a regular basis. As I have said, we don't have a choice but to ensure that our policies are updated. How do we update them? By identifying gaps through audits and identifying corrective measures. Then the last point for today is promoting continuous training and professional development. Let us train our accountants, train our HR managers, train our engineers, train our legal experts, just like we have done in the last 2-3 days. That through this training, we have acquired some skills and knowledge that may be useful back in our organizations. And again, it's a legal requirement under IHRM Act that for you to get your licenses renewed, you need to demonstrate that you have enhanced your skills through CPDs, continuous professional development. So again, I want to encourage us to train our employees, not only in their areas of specialization, but on other matters to do with HR, particularly HR policies, HR practices, HR processes, and the legal compliance. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you to ask questions as we finish this series. So the floor is ours. Please ask any questions that you may have, any comments, and possibly any compliments.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes, in regards to compliance.
Mm-hmm.
The law states that leave days, pending leave days are paid.
Yes.
Yes, when it comes to termination. But,
that's correct.
But there was this court case that got me confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, an employee went to court.
Yeah.
Yes, and sued the employer for not paying him his pending leave days. But then the court ruled in favor of the employer,
which is unexpected.
Yes, the court ruled in favor of the employer, stating that the employer is not in a position to pay the employee the pending days because the employee cannot prove that he applied for leave and his leave was rejected.
Okay.
So it was a bit confusing. Yeah. So I thought it was clear. If you have pending leave days, then you ought to be paid automatically.
Okay.
Yeah, so work on that.
Yes, maybe I can comment on that. Usually, one, the court, that is the Labor Relations Court, relies on the facts presented before it. And it's on the basis of the facts that the judges make their rulings. Secondly, looking at what may have happened before the termination might also be considered depending on whether the employee was given the leave days and he or she decided not to go for leave. If these two aspects are what happened, then possibly the employee presented a weak case. And a weak case is one that is not based on tangible facts. Two, and this is Kenya, anything can happen. That employers can get orders either to reinstate or to maintain the dismissal or sustain the dismissal. So whatever happened could be on the basis of facts that the court was presented and how the employee argued out his or her case. So coming to utilization of leave days, all leave days are earned. So people are entitled to leave days for working. So the employee must have worked for a whole year for him or her to earn the leave days. So an employee cannot start earning leave days unless they have worked for a year and beyond. If these leave days have not been earned, meaning that there are a few days that are remaining for him or her to go on leave, then the employer may not be at liberty to pay those leave days. Or if the employee had taken some days which could be recovered from the leave days, then again, the employer may not pay for those days that have been taken. So if they are beyond the required leave days, then the employer was right by not paying for the leave days upon termination. I think I've answered your question.
Yes, you have, Mwalimu. Thank you very much. I appreciate.
You're welcome. So, Wairimu, if you have a question, you can ask. So apparently Wairimu is not there. I want us to stop there.
I have another one.
Yes.
I have another one still on the matter of compliance. So this is very wide. Yeah. Okay. The labor laws, you had mentioned salary deduction. Yeah, that the employer does not have any right to deduct an employee's salary.
Yes, except the statutory ones.
So I have this scenario. Employees are expected to work for 160 hours.
Yeah.
Yes, and then there is this employee that has not reached their 160 hours. His hours are, for instance, let's say 80 hours, 80 hours, or let's say 100 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And so is the employer allowed to deduct the salary of the days the employee missed, of the hours missed?
Okay.
Is it legal for the
May I
employer
answer
to?
that question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. When we sign our employment contracts, the working hours and the payments are clearly stated that an employee is supposed to work for this number of days or hours, and the payment is for that period of time. The law, especially the Employment Act, envisages that the employee will work for the specified period of time in the contract. However, if the employee has not worked for a specified number of hours as required in the contract, then the employer is at liberty to deduct the days he or she did not work. That is the right of employees to demand service from the employees and to meet the required standards in the contract. So the Employment Act does not prevent an employer from deducting payment for not meeting the required standard. So you can only abstain from deducting anything else if the employee has met all the requirements. They have attended work as required. They have met the performance requirements, and they also have maintained high degrees of discipline. Because if you break company property, we will deduct from your salary some amount of money to compensate the damage, if the damage is willful. So if the employee does not meet the expected part of the bargain in the contract, then the employer can deduct the salaries or the days that they did not attend work. I think that is clear.
Very clear. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So if there is anybody who wants to make a last comment or statement, I'll give you 1 second.
Thank you very much, Mwalimu. I appreciate the session, or rather the sessions for this week were so engaging and very clear. Yeah, and hopefully when I get back to the organization, I'll be able to implement. Yes, and I appreciate how you articulate and how you present the whole training. Thank you very much. It is well understood.
Thank you very much. I'm humbled by your kind words, and I hope to do better next time than I have done, but I've always done very well. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for trusting us as ACHRP. I look forward to seeing you again very soon. And thank you for having me. I want to wish you a good afternoon and a good weekend ahead. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend and have a lovely afternoon yourself.